A seat of discomfort. The airport buzzed with the usual chaotic symphony of rolling luggage, hurried footsteps, and muffled flight announcements. Business professionals in pressed suits checked their watches impatiently, while families corralled their restless children, hoping for a smooth journey. The gate for Flight 2296 from Atlanta to San Francisco had just begun boarding, and among the passengers was Dr. Daniel Carter, a man who had spent a lifetime balancing grace and resilience in the face of challenges few would ever understand. Daniel, a 47-year-old professor of African American Studies, was returning from a week-long academic conference where he had given a keynote on racial biases in modern society. The irony of what was about to happen on this flight wouldn't be lost on him. With his leather messenger bag slung over one shoulder, Daniel made his way to seat 15A in premium economy, the section just behind first class. It wasn't exactly luxury, but it offered more space, a worthwhile upgrade for a 5-hour flight. He was looking forward to reading a new manuscript, making notes for an upcoming book he was editing, and maybe even catching a little sleep. As he settled into his seat, adjusting his reading glasses and pulling out a hardcover book, he barely noticed the family settling in behind him. It wasn't until the first kick landed against the back of his seat that he became aware of their presence. At first, he ignored it. It was a small tap, probably just a child adjusting in their seat. Then came another, and another. Daniel sighed inwardly. He had been on enough flights to know that children sometimes got restless, especially before takeoff. He shifted slightly, hoping the movement would signal to the child's parents that their kid was disrupting a passenger in front of them. But the kicks didn't stop. A growing problem. Daniel turned slightly, casting a glance over his shoulder. Behind him sat a blond-haired boy, no older than 8, swinging his feet carelessly. His sneakers, the kind that lit up with every movement, flashed in bursts of blue and red each time his legs shot forward. Next to him, his mother, a well-dressed woman in her late 30s, wearing oversized designer sunglasses despite being indoors, was scrolling through her phone, completely oblivious. Daniel cleared his throat and spoke in a calm, measured voice. "Excuse me, ma'am," he said, keeping his tone polite but firm. "Would you mind asking your son to stop kicking my seat?" The woman looked up as if noticing him for the first time. She sighed dramatically, then nudged her son without looking away from her phone. "Ethan, baby, stop that," she murmured distractedly. Ethan smirked but didn't respond. The kicking stopped, at least for a few seconds. Daniel turned back around, hoping that was the end of it. He reopened his book, letting his eyes scan the first few paragraphs again. Thump. His fingers tightened slightly around the pages. Thump. Thump. Daniel closed his book again. A clash of expectations. This time, he turned around fully. "Ma'am, I really need him to stop. It's been going on for several minutes now." The woman finally removed her sunglasses and rolled her eyes. "He's just a kid," she said flatly. "What do you expect me to do? Tie his legs together?" Daniel kept his expression neutral. "No, ma'am. I just expect him to be respectful, like every other passenger on this flight." She scoffed. "Wow, some people are just so uptight these days." A few passengers nearby glanced up from their seats, sensing the tension brewing. Ethan, who had been watching this exchange with the delight of a child who knew he was untouchable, grinned before deliberately swinging his feet again, harder this time. Thump. 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 Daniel exhaled slowly, counting to 3 in his head. He had dealt with microaggressions, dismissive attitudes, and outright disrespect before, but something about this situation gnawed at him. It wasn't just about the seat kicking. It was the way the mother dismissed his concerns outright, as though his comfort was secondary or non-existent. He had seen this double standard too many times. A black man being too direct was seen as aggressive, but a white mother refusing to control her child was excusable. He took another breath, knowing that any further escalation would only play into a narrative that wasn't fair, but was always waiting to be weaponized against him. He decided to try one last time. With patience still laced in his voice, he said, "I understand that kids can be restless, but this is a 5-hour flight. I just need him to keep his feet down." The woman gave an exaggerated sigh and turned to her son. "Ethan, be nice." Ethan gave no sign that he had heard her. But for a brief moment, the kicking stopped. The flight takes off. So does the conflict. The pilot's voice came over the intercom, announcing final preparations for takeoff. Flight attendants moved down the aisle, securing overhead compartments and reminding passengers to buckle their seatbelts. Daniel tried to focus on his book again. Then, just as the plane began its ascent, the kicking returned, this time even more forceful than before. Thump, thump, thump. He gritted his teeth. The woman wasn't even pretending to care anymore. Daniel had spent his entire life picking his battles, knowing that as a black man, society always expected him to absorb disrespect with a smile. But he also knew that ignoring something didn't always make it go away. He pressed the flight attendant button. The flight attendant's intervention. A few minutes later, Lauren Whittaker, one of the flight attendants, appeared. She was in her late 20s, her uniform crisp, her expression professional but warm. "Good evening, sir. Is there something I can help with?" Daniel nodded. "Yes, I've asked multiple times, but the child behind me keeps kicking my seat. It's been happening since before takeoff." Lauren turned to the boy, then to his mother. "Ma'am, could you please make sure your son keeps his feet down?" The mother huffed. "Oh, come on. He's just a kid. He's not hurting anyone." Lauren's smile didn't waver. "I understand that, ma'am. But we ask that all passengers be mindful of those around them." The woman leaned back, crossing her arms. "Whatever. This is ridiculous." Ethan, sensing his mother's approval, grinned defiantly. He swung his foot one last time. Hard. Bam! Daniel felt his seat jerk forward from the force of it. A collective hush fell over the nearby passengers. Lauren's face changed. For the first time, Ethan looked uncertain. The tension in the air was thick, and Daniel knew. This was the moment that would determine how this flight would go. And no one on this plane was prepared for what happened next. At breaking point, at 35,000 feet, the moment Ethan's foot struck the back of Daniel's seat with force, the plane, though still filled with the hum of conversations, rustling papers, and the occasional ding of a call button, felt like it had entered a moment of suspended silence. Daniel inhaled sharply, his fingers tightening around the hardcover book in his lap. He had endured 30 minutes of unchecked kicks, a dismissive mother, and the growing weight of every eye on the plane now focused on him. He knew how these situations played out. If he raised his voice, he'd be the angry black man. If he stayed silent, he'd be weak. And if he tried to reason, he'd be too sensitive. It was a no-win situation. And yet Lauren, the flight attendant, wasn't backing down either. She took a step closer to Ethan's mother, tilting her head slightly, the way someone does when they've given far too much patience to a situation that doesn't deserve it. "Ma'am," Lauren said, her tone clipped but professional, "I understand that children can be restless, but this is now a repeated disturbance. If Ethan doesn't keep his feet to himself, I will have to escalate this matter to the cabin supervisor." Ethan's mother let out an exaggerated laugh, the kind meant to make everyone around her an ally in her frustration. She looked around at the nearby passengers as if expecting them to join in her amusement. "You've got to be kidding me," she scoffed. "Are we seriously making a federal case out of a little boy's fidgeting?" Daniel kept his gaze steady on her. A little boy's fidgeting. This wasn't about a restless child anymore. This was about a refusal to acknowledge boundaries, a blatant disregard for respect, and the unsettling realization that some people believed they were above consequences. Lauren, unfazed, folded her arms. This is the final warning. The ripple effect of privilege. Ethan's mother scoffed again and turned toward her son. "Baby, are you kicking this man's seat?" Ethan smirked but shook his head. "No, Mommy." "A lie. A few passengers in earshot gasped quietly, sensing the boldness of the deception. Daniel closed his eyes for a moment. He had spent years studying the nuances of human behavior, of bias and entitlement, and how it all played out in everyday life. This wasn't just a misbehaving child. This was a lesson in how privilege is cultivated, nurtured, and weaponized. Ethan had kicked Daniel's seat for half an hour. The mother had ignored it, dismissed it, and then laughed about it. And now, when confronted, they had chosen to lie outright, rather than take accountability. Lauren's expression didn't change. "I'll be back shortly," she said firmly before walking toward the front of the plane. Daniel felt the weight of the mother's gaze shift back to him. "I hope you're happy," she sneered, traumatizing a little boy over absolutely nothing. Daniel's lips parted slightly in disbelief. Before he could respond, a voice from 2 rows behind them cut through the moment. "I saw it," a middle-aged white woman with salt and pepper hair said, lowering her reading glasses. "Your son was kicking his seat the whole time." Another voice. "Yeah, I saw it too." It was a young man in his 20s, his AirPods dangling from his ears. "It wasn't just 1 or 2 times, lady. Your kid's been going at it like it's a soccer match." A few murmurs of agreement rippled through the rows. Ethan's mother's face paled. For the first time, she realized she was losing the room. The unexpected arrival of the cabin supervisor. Less than 5 minutes later, Lauren returned, this time accompanied by a tall man in a navy blue uniform with gold stripes on the sleeves. The cabin supervisor, James Holloway. James was in his early 50s, his posture rigid and commanding, the kind of presence that demanded respect without a single raised voice. He crouched slightly to make eye contact with Daniel first. "Sir, I understand you've been dealing with an issue regarding the seat behind you." Daniel nodded, keeping his expression neutral. "Yes, I've asked multiple times for the kicking to stop, and it hasn't. I called the flight attendant when it continued. I just want to sit in peace for the remainder of this flight." James turned his attention to Ethan's mother, whose arms were now crossed so tightly across her chest that her fingers dug into her elbows. "Ma'am," he said, his voice calm but authoritative, "we've had multiple passenger complaints regarding this disturbance. I have to insist that your son refrain from any further disruption." Ethan's mother was breathing heavily now, the weight of the situation crashing down on her. "This is insane," she spat. "I paid for these seats just like everyone else. Are you really harassing a mother and her child over something this ridiculous?" James didn't blink. "Ma'am, we have eyewitness accounts from other passengers who have confirmed that your son has been repeatedly disrupting the passenger in front of him. If this behavior continues, we will have no choice but to report it upon landing, and you may face penalties for non-compliance with airline conduct policies." That did it. The woman visibly deflated, the reality sinking in. She turned toward Ethan, her voice now sharp and clipped. "Ethan, keep your feet down." The boy frowned, kicking the base of his own seat in frustration but not touching Daniel's anymore. James gave a small nod before turning back to Daniel. "If there's any further issue, sir, please don't hesitate to call for assistance." With that, he and Lauren walked away, leaving a charged silence in their wake. The consequence of an unchecked ego. For a moment, Daniel thought the ordeal was over. Then Ethan's mother leaned forward, her voice low but dripping with venom. "You must be real proud of yourself," she whispered, her breath hot against the back of his seat. "Getting a child in trouble. You people always play the victim." Daniel's stomach clenched. It wasn't the words themselves that surprised him. It was the casual way she said it, as if she had been waiting for the opportunity. And suddenly, everything made sense. This wasn't just about Ethan being an unruly child. It was about a mother who believed she and her son were entitled to behave however they pleased, and when challenged, defaulted to the same tired script of blaming the person of color for their own wrongdoing. Daniel took a breath, forcing his pulse to steady. He turned around, locking eyes with her. For the first time, she looked away first. She wasn't used to being confronted. Daniel smiled, not in triumph, but in understanding. "You have a good flight, ma'am," he said evenly, before turning back to his book. And for the first time since boarding, he read in peace. The tipping point at 35,000 feet. The plane cruised steadily at 35,000 feet, but the air inside the cabin felt thick with tension. Though the immediate issues seemed to have been resolved, an uncomfortable undercurrent of unease remained. Passengers had witnessed the entire ordeal: a mother's entitlement, a flight attendant's firm stance, a child's misbehavior, and a black man trying to claim the basic right of peace. And now, as the hum of the engines filled the cabin, the echoes of what had happened lingered. Daniel turned a page in his book, but he wasn't reading. He could still feel the resentful energy radiating from the seat behind him, the weight of Ethan's mother's glare pressing against his back like an unspoken threat. And then, just when Daniel thought things might settle, Ethan kicked his seat again. A child's defiance, or a mother's war. The kick wasn't as forceful as before, but it was deliberate. Daniel closed his eyes for a beat, exhaling slowly. He knew this wasn't about Ethan anymore. This was about his mother sending a message, a silent act of defiance, a power play. Daniel turned his head slightly, his jaw tightening as he debated what to do. He could press the call button again, but at this point, it would be clear Ethan's mother was actively provoking him. He glanced around the cabin. Some passengers had returned to their in-flight movies, others sipped their drinks or quietly chatted. But a few pairs of eyes flicked toward him, passengers who had witnessed everything, waiting to see what he would do next. Would he ignore it? Would he escalate? Would he let it slide? The weight of their silent expectations was suffocating. Then the decision was made for him. An ally in an unexpected place. A voice cut through the charged silence. "Excuse me." It was the middle-aged white woman who had spoken up earlier. She was seated diagonally across the aisle and had been watching the entire situation unfold. Ethan's mother barely acknowledged her at first, but the woman leaned forward slightly, her reading glasses resting on the tip of her nose. "I saw your son kick his seat again," she said, her tone polite but firm. "And frankly, I think it's time you start parenting instead of making this everyone else's problem." The mother snapped her gaze toward the woman, her expression twisting with irritation. "I beg your pardon." The woman didn't flinch. "You heard me." Ethan's mother laughed, but this time it lacked the carefree amusement from earlier. "Are you seriously inserting yourself into this? What are you, the flight police?" The woman tilted her head. "No. Just someone who respects basic human decency." A ripple of murmurs spread across the nearby passengers. Others who had been silent until now were suddenly emboldened. "She's right," another voice chimed in. A man sitting near the emergency exit. "Your kid's been out of control, and you've been acting like none of it is happening." "Exactly," added a young woman wearing earbuds. "If my kid acted like that, I'd be mortified." Ethan's mother's face turned red, her frustration boiling over into visible rage. "Oh, so now I'm the bad guy," she snapped, her voice rising. "All of you are ganging up on me and my child because we dared to exist in this space." The shift in her tone was unmistakable. She was playing the victim now, twisting the situation to make herself seem like the wronged party. Daniel recognized the tactic. He'd seen it play out in boardrooms, on social media, in everyday interactions. When faced with accountability, some people deflected. And yet, this time, it wasn't working. More voices spoke up, passengers who had been silent before now refusing to let the narrative be manipulated. "No, ma'am," said an older black gentleman a few rows ahead. "This isn't about race. This is about common courtesy." "Exactly," said the middle-aged woman. "And I, for one, am tired of watching decent people be mistreated because someone refuses to teach their child basic respect." Ethan's mother opened her mouth, but no words came out. For the first time since the ordeal had begun, she was outnumbered. And she knew it. The flight crew intervenes, again. Lauren, the flight attendant, returned swiftly, clearly having heard the rising voices. "Is there another issue here?" she asked, her sharp eyes scanning the row. Ethan's mother immediately adopted a defensive posture, flipping the script before Lauren could even fully assess the situation. "This is harassment," she declared, motioning toward the passengers who had spoken against her. "I am being ganged up on for absolutely no reason. These people are bullying me and my child just because he was a little restless." Lauren turned toward Daniel. "Sir, did the kicking continue?" Daniel locked eyes with Lauren. He didn't need to answer. The other passengers did it for him. "Yes," came the unified response from at least 4 different voices. Lauren's expression hardened. She turned to Ethan's mother. "Ma'am, I have already given you a warning, and I have been more than patient. But I need you to understand that if this behavior continues, we will be forced to take further action." Ethan's mother's jaw clenched. "Further action," she repeated, her voice laced with barely concealed fury. Lauren nodded. "Yes, ma'am. That means an official report, documentation, and possible intervention by airline security upon landing." The color drained from Ethan's mother's face. That was the moment it hit her. This wasn't a petty squabble anymore. This was serious. The power dynamic had shifted completely. Her usual tactics, deflection, manipulation, playing the victim, had failed. And now, she was dangerously close to real consequences, a final warning, and a lesson in accountability. Ethan's mother inhaled sharply, her nostrils flaring. Then, without another word, she turned to Ethan. Her voice was low, but Daniel caught the sharpness in her tone. "Not another sound." Ethan's eyes widened. He looked like he wanted to protest, but something in his mother's tightened grip on his arm made him stop. Lauren gave a final nod. "I appreciate your cooperation." Then, with a professional smile that barely masked the exhaustion beneath it, she turned and walked away. For the first time since takeoff, the tension in the air began to dissipate. The aftermath. Daniel didn't turn around again. He didn't need to. The seat remained still. No more kicks, no more whispered remarks. Peace had finally settled over row 14. And yet Daniel knew this was bigger than just a flight, a mother, or a child. This was about the quiet battles people fought every day, against entitlement, against unspoken prejudices, against the belief that some people deserved more respect than others simply because of who they were. As the plane continued toward San Francisco, Daniel opened his book again. And this time, he actually read The Unfinished Battle at 35,000 feet. The tension that had filled the cabin moments ago seemed to have settled, but only on the surface. For the first time since takeoff, Ethan's feet remained still. No more kicking, no more deliberate jabs at the seat in front of him. And yet, despite the outward calm, Daniel could feel the weight of unspoken resentment pressing into his back, just as much as the child's feet had. He wasn't the only one. Passengers who had spoken up in his defense remained alert, watching carefully, as if expecting another eruption. The air inside the cabin wasn't heavy with noise anymore. It was heavy with anticipation. Something was going to happen. And no one knew what. A mother's quiet rage. Ethan's mother sat in rigid silence, her arms crossed so tightly across her chest that her fingernails dug into her skin. Her face was turned toward the window, but the energy radiating from her was unmistakable, a storm barely contained beneath the surface. She had lost. She wasn't used to losing. Her entire life, people had looked the other way when she threw tantrums in department stores, in coffee shops, at PTA meetings. She had always been able to twist the narrative, to shift blame, to turn herself into the victim no matter the situation. But this time, she had been called out, publicly, and worse, by people she considered beneath her. She clenched her jaw, her humiliation simmering into fury. Her gaze drifted down to Ethan, who sat staring at the seat in front of him, gripping the armrest as if afraid to move. For once, he was silent. She hated seeing him like this, defeated. She leaned in and whispered sharply, "Don't let them win, baby." Ethan turned his head slightly, confused. "Those people," she muttered. "They love putting us in our place." Ethan's brows furrowed, his 8-year-old mind trying to make sense of what she was telling him. She placed a hand on his shoulder, squeezing. "They don't get to tell us what to do." And just like that, the seed was planted. Daniel's reflection. Daniel tried to focus on his book, but the words on the page blurred together. He knew this wasn't over. It was never just about a seat. It was never just about a child kicking. This was about power, about who got to have peace, who got to be respected, and who was expected to just let things go. He had spent his entire life navigating these unspoken rules, the quiet battles, the subtle expectations that he should always be the bigger person. It wasn't always blatant. It was in the way store employees watched him more closely when he browsed. It was in the way some colleagues spoke over him in meetings, then repeated his ideas as if they were their own. It was in the way he had to measure his reactions carefully, because if he ever showed even a fraction of the frustration he felt, he would be labeled angry or aggressive. And now he was on a plane, simply trying to get from one place to another. And even here, the battle followed him. An unsettling encounter. The flight continued in tense silence for another hour. Daniel had almost begun to relax when he noticed movement out of the corner of his eye. He turned his head slightly and saw Ethan standing in the aisle, staring at him. The boy's expression was unreadable. For a brief moment, Daniel wondered if the kid was going to apologize. If, despite his mother's influence, he had recognized that what he did was wrong. But then, Ethan smirked, a small, knowing smirk, and Daniel knew. His mother had said something to him. The quiet tension between them had just shifted into something more insidious. Before Daniel could say anything, Ethan turned and ran down the aisle, weaving through passengers toward the restroom. Daniel exhaled slowly, forcing himself to remain calm. But something deep inside him twisted, because he recognized that look in the boy's eyes. It was the same look he had seen in bullies who pretended to trip him in school hallways. The same look he had seen in men who smirked while telling offensive jokes, daring him to react. And now, it was in the eyes of an 8-year-old child. The whispered threat. Minutes later, as the plane continued its steady journey, Ethan returned to his seat. As he passed Daniel, he slowed just enough to whisper, so low that only Daniel could hear. "My mom says you're just making a fuss because people like you always want attention." Daniel didn't react, didn't turn, didn't flinch. But inside, something broke. Not from pain, not from anger, but from exhaustion. Because this was how it started. This was how a child learned prejudice before he was even old enough to understand the full weight of what he was saying. And he knew this wouldn't be the last time Ethan would say something like this to someone, because the seed had been planted, and no one had stopped it from growing. The flight attendant's final move. Lauren, the flight attendant, reappeared at that moment. She didn't hear what Ethan had whispered, but she saw the look on Daniel's face, and that was enough. She approached Ethan's mother with a firm expression. "Ma'am," she said, her voice calm but commanding. "I need to inform you that upon landing, airline security will be escorting you off the plane." Ethan's mother's head snapped up. "What? You've repeatedly ignored crew instructions, and multiple passengers have reported your behavior. This is standard protocol." Passengers nearby exchanged glances of silent satisfaction. For the first time, Ethan's mother looked truly shaken. I didn't do anything wrong," she protested. "This is ridiculous. You're targeting me and my child." Lauren's voice didn't waver. "This decision has been made. You may choose to comply, or we will escalate further upon landing." A hush fell over the cabin. Everyone felt it now. The power shift. For once, privilege wasn't enough to protect her from consequences. And Daniel, for the first time since the flight began, he felt something close to peace. Landing into chaos, the plane began its descent. Outside the window, the city lights of San Francisco sparkled against the evening sky, a breathtaking contrast to the storm brewing inside the aircraft. Inside the cabin, however, no one was admiring the view. Every passenger within earshot of seat 14A was waiting, watching, bracing for what would happen next. For most of the flight, the conflict had simmered beneath the surface. But now, with airline security waiting at the gate, the tension had finally reached its boiling point. And at the center of it all sat Ethan's mother, furious, fuming, and completely unwilling to go down without a fight. A mother on the edge. As the flight crew made final announcements, Ethan's mother sat rigidly in her seat, her hands gripping the armrests so tightly her knuckles turned white. She wasn't going to accept this. She had spent her entire life demanding to be treated with the respect she thought she deserved. And yet here she was, about to be escorted off a flight like some common criminal. She wasn't going to let that happen. She turned sharply toward Lauren, the flight attendant, who had just finished checking the overhead bins. "This is harassment," she hissed, her voice laced with venom. Lauren remained calm, professional. "Ma'am, we've explained the situation. You have continuously disrupted this flight, and multiple passengers have raised complaints." Ethan's mother's nostrils flared. "I want to speak to your supervisor." Lauren nodded. "They'll be waiting for you at the gate." That wasn't the answer she wanted. She wanted an apology. She wanted someone to back down. But instead, everyone was standing firm against her. And that was something she wasn't used to. Her eyes flickered over to Daniel, who had remained silent for the last 30 minutes, but not out of fear, out of exhaustion. And she hated that. She hated the way he just sat there, calm, unbothered, refusing to give her the reaction she wanted. So she decided to push one last time. One last shot. She leaned in, speaking low enough for only Daniel to hear. "You should have just ignored it," she spat. Daniel didn't flinch. She sneered. "But you people can never let things go, can you?" Silence. She leaned back, smug, as if she had just won some final battle. But then Daniel turned his head slightly, his voice quiet but firm. "Ignoring it is how people like you get away with this for so long." The smug look flickered. And for the first time, she didn't have a comeback. The descent into consequences. As the plane landed, a sharp mechanical whine filled the cabin as the wheels made contact with the runway. Passengers exhaled in relief. But for Ethan's mother, relief was nowhere to be found. Her fingers twitched, her mind racing. She wasn't going to let this end like this. As the plane taxied toward the gate, she turned to Ethan. "Get your things, baby. We're leaving." Ethan, now pale and quiet, hesitated before slowly reaching for his backpack. Passengers around them muttered under their breath. Some shook their heads. Others stole glances at Daniel, as if silently apologizing for everything that had happened. But Daniel didn't need an apology. He just wanted this flight to be over. "The gate awaits." As the seatbelt sign switched off, passengers stood up immediately, eager to grab their bags and get off the plane. Lauren had disappeared to the front of the cabin, but Daniel knew why. Security was already waiting. And sure enough, when the doors finally opened, 2 uniformed airline security officers stepped on board. A murmur spread through the cabin as people realized what was happening. Passengers exchanged glances. Some even pulled out their phones, ready to record. And then, the moment of truth. One of the officers, a tall, stern-faced black man with a badge reading T. Sanders, stepped forward. He cleared his throat. "Ma'am, we need to have a conversation before you exit the plane." Ethan's mother froze. For the first time since this whole ordeal began, she looked scared. The spectacle of privilege falling apart. "This is ridiculous," she blurted, loud enough for everyone to hear. Passengers watched in stunned silence as she launched into a frantic tirade. "I didn't do anything wrong. I'm being treated like a criminal for what? Because some whiny man couldn't handle a kid kicking his seat." She whipped her head toward Daniel, her face twisted in fury. "You think you're a victim? You're pathetic." Gasps rippled through the cabin, but Officer Sanders didn't blink. "Ma'am," he said firmly, "you are coming with us." Her mouth opened to argue again. But then she saw the cameras. Passengers were filming, recording every second of this. She had already lost. Her face turned red as she finally shut her mouth and grabbed Ethan's hand. Ethan, silent and shaken, followed as she stormed off the plane, escorted by both officers. And just like that, she was gone. The aftermath. As the last of the passengers began to exit, Lauren approached Daniel. "Are you okay?" she asked softly. Daniel exhaled, running a hand over his face. He had no idea how tired he was until now. He glanced at her and gave a small, tired smile. "I will be." Lauren nodded, a flicker of guilt in her eyes. "I should have stepped in sooner." "I'm sorry." Daniel shook his head. "You did what you could." She hesitated before adding, "You weren't alone in this. A lot of people had your back today." Daniel glanced around. Passengers who had stood up for him earlier now gave him small, reassuring nods as they gathered their belongings. For once, he didn't feel invisible. Maybe things wouldn't change overnight. Maybe kids like Ethan would still grow up learning the same patterns, the same biases. But today was different. And for now, that was enough. The fallout. The plane had landed. The ordeal was over. But the real storm was only just beginning. By the time Daniel stepped into the terminal at San Francisco International Airport, his phone was already buzzing. He ignored it at first. He was too tired to deal with anything right now. But then, as he made his way to the baggage claim, he overheard something that made his stomach tighten. "Yo, did you see that lady lose her mind on the plane?" "Yeah, bro. It's all over Twitter. She got dragged off by security. Hella embarrassing." Daniel froze. His pulse quickened as he finally pulled out his phone. And sure enough, the video was everywhere. The internet explodes. The footage was brutal. Someone had started recording about 10 minutes before the plane landed, capturing everything. Ethan's mother's meltdown, her racist remark, her being escorted off the plane while everyone watched. And now, millions of people had seen it. Daniel scrolled through the replies, his jaw tightening as he took in the reactions. Another entitled Karen gets exactly what she deserves. This is cinema. The way she thought she could get away with this, and now she's viral. The internet stays undefeated. Nah, but can we talk about that poor kid though? The real victim here is him. Imagine growing up with a mother like that. Some comments were supportive, others were brutal. And then there were the ones that made Daniel's stomach turn. "So we're just canceling white women now. Cool. Guess y'all forgot free speech exists." This is fake, woke nonsense. People are too sensitive. She was just defending her kid. Oh great, another race-baiting sob story. Maybe if he wasn't such a snowflake, this wouldn't be news. Daniel let out a slow breath, shutting off his phone. He should have known this was going to happen. Because no matter what happened in real life, online, the narrative was always up for grabs. Ethan's mother faces the consequences. Meanwhile, somewhere in the airport, Ethan's mother was living her worst nightmare. Security had not arrested her, but they had detained her for questioning, which meant she was forced to sit there while an airline representative politely explained that she was now banned from flying with their airline indefinitely. She had screamed. She had threatened lawsuits. She had demanded to speak to the CEO. None of it mattered. She had been blacklisted. And the worst part, her meltdown was trending on social media. Millions of people had watched her lose control, exposing her for the person she truly was. For years, she had moved through life untouchable. But today, the world had watched her fall. and she couldn't do anything to stop it. Daniel's unexpected spotlight. Back in baggage claim, Daniel picked up his suitcase and tried to slip away unnoticed. But that was impossible now. As he wheeled his bag toward the exit, a stranger stopped him. "Hey man, are you the guy from the plane?" Daniel stiffened. "Here we go." The guy was young, maybe early 20s, wearing a hoodie and sneakers. He held up his phone, the screen still showing the viral video. "That was you, right? Dude, you handled that like a boss. Respect." Before Daniel could even respond, another person approached. "I saw the video too," said a woman in her 30s, shaking her head. "I can't believe that woman actually said that to you. You were so patient." More people started recognizing him. Some just gave him knowing nods. Others whispered his name to each other, as if they were in the presence of someone famous. Daniel felt his chest tighten. He didn't want this. He hadn't asked to be part of some viral moment. He had just wanted a peaceful flight. Now, his face was all over the internet. And that meant one thing: his life was about to change. Backlash and media frenzy. By the time Daniel made it home that night, the situation had escalated. News outlets were covering the story. TV segments, talk shows, podcasts. Everyone had an opinion. The airline released a formal statement, confirming that they had taken action against the disruptive passenger. Reporters reached out to Daniel's workplace, trying to get a comment from him. And then, the final bombshell. Ethan's mother had spoken to the media. And, unsurprisingly, she had a very different version of events. "This is absolutely ridiculous," she told a conservative news outlet. "My child and I were humiliated and treated unfairly just because some overly sensitive man decided he was offended. My son was just being a kid. This cancel culture nonsense has gone too far." The anchor nodded sympathetically, as if she was the true victim in all this. Daniel wanted to laugh, but he didn't, because he knew how these things worked. For some people, facts didn't matter, and no matter how clear the video evidence was, there would always be people willing to defend the indefensible. A call that changed everything. Just as Daniel was about to turn off his phone for the night, it rang. An unknown number. Normally, he would have ignored it, but something told him to pick up. "Hello." A warm, professional voice greeted him. "Mr. Daniels, this is Jessica Harper. I work in media relations for CNN. We'd love to invite you onto our program to share your side of the story." Daniel blinked. "My side?" "Yes. We believe your experience is part of a larger conversation about racial bias, entitlement, and airline accountability. We want to give you a platform to discuss it." Daniel exhaled slowly. A platform. A chance to speak up, to actually say something beyond just being a face in a viral clip. It was an opportunity. But did he want it? Did he want to step into the spotlight even further? Or was it safer to just let the internet move on to the next trending scandal? He had a choice to make. Stay silent, or speak his truth.